I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of transition risk. This one is going to be from the perspective of banks. I'm going to come on to the regulations in a second, because both kind of the economic element of transition risk and the regulatory elements of transition risk are both examples of that. So I want to focus on the Alberta oil patch here. And I'm going to start with a disclaimer. We do, as a bank, still bank the oil and gas industry. That is part of our strategy. Our strategy is to help them transition to low carbon lending models. So I'm not throwing spears at our oil and gas clients here. We're trying to help them transition rather than cut off credit to them totally. But what I will say is that the prognosis for the Canadian oil and gas industry is not necessarily particularly fantastic over the next 30 or so years without very, very fundamental changes to its business model. Why? Well, number one, the Canadian government's carbon price ramping up to $170 a tonne massively impacts costs of production. It also impacts the cost at which these oil and gas products, hydrocarbon products, can be sold at the pump. So that has upstream impacts on the industry itself. How does that relate to how does that relate to the construction industry? Well, you can see here the chart on the left. I think this is a McKinsey study from a couple of years ago. But what they tried to do was isolate the impact of the carbon tax on the oil and gas industry in Alberta. And that isolated impact alone is estimated to drive between a negative 10 and negative 20% decrease in Alberta's GDP. Now, that's not to say that's going to happen. That isolates for a number of things. There are probably going to be other industries that buck that trend. And I'm not saying Alberta's going to see its GDP shrink by a fifth over 20 years. But irrespective of that, those are big figures. So if you're a builder or developer, if you're a real estate operator with material exposure to the oil and gas industry in Alberta, everything may have looked fairly sunny, since the last boom cycle, since 2014 or whatever, but it's not necessarily going to in the future. And again, it's not to say you divest from supporting oil and gas clients, but it should at least put the thought in your mind of, well, is my portfolio outsized in its exposure to this industry? Do I need to think about expanding, diversifying, and managing that transition risk myself? And again, as a bank, we will look at our borrowers' business models, see where their biggest exposures are, and see how we think that that places them vis-a-vis their ability to pay us debt back. Again, climate risk is credit risk, and if your credit risk is high, the availability of credit, the price of credit will decrease.